Hello, and welcome back to the Can You Dig It podcast, where we dig down, dig deep, and dig in to the process of self-discovery and personal growth. I'm here with Jessica Rubello from Unleash Potential Life Coaching. Hey, Jess. And I'm Jordan Nocht from the Center for Alignment, bringing 2+ decades of combined coaching and counseling experience for both of us to this exploration of the theory, but more importantly, the application of concepts in mental health, emotional awareness, and mention it again, personal growth. Today's episode is a continuation. It is a sequel, if you will, to the first episode on anxiety. So this will be the second in our series, which will probably have anywhere from 3 to 5 episodes, depending on how deep we choose to dig. I love saying the word dig. I feel like it's like when you say the name of a movie in a movie, you just get to like, oh, he said the name, you know? Like, cracking myself up over here. It's our second episode of anxiety. In the last episode, we talked a lot about some of the theories on it, some perspectives on it, but it was a lot of discussion about application of coping mechanisms and coping techniques and different things people can do with anxiety when it is present, it is in my life. What can I start doing differently? And I know we wanted to kind of recap after talking about last episode. You and I caught some things that we wanted to dive a little deeper into, and maybe add a couple things we neglected to either say clearly or just neglected to say completely, because in 28 minutes off the cuff, it's hard to get it all in. So I'm going to turn it over to you. What are some of the things you feel are really important to recap and highlight from the previous episode, and some things we might want to add?
So I think just based off what you were just saying of like coping, right? Like, what do we even mean by coping, and what's the purpose of coping? And I think that might be like a good starting point for like the recap of this session too, is like, we cope to get the symptoms down, or get to the symptoms down to a place of somewhat regulation. So then we could do another type of skill to help release the anxiety, right? A lot of times, and I know last episode, we spoke a lot about how anxiety is affecting the body and how it sits in the body or it sits in the brain, and that affects our behaviors. Is anxiety needs somewhere to go, and we need to allow it to go there, but we need to also then do something to get it to that point, right? So like we spoke about the ice cubes and the sour candies, and like those are great, but you're not going to do that all day, every day, throughout the day. It's like, no, let's just get the symptoms down to a point, then go for a run, right? Like release it through your body, dance in your kitchen, go for a walk, do something to just get it out. And I think that's something that we didn't necessarily clarify last week. And I don't want our viewers to listen to like, oh, I tried an ice cube and I'm still anxious and this didn't work. You know what I mean? Like there's more to it than just that.
Right. So it's like when we say coping, what we're talking about is getting through the initial onslaught of symptomology. That's just
like the intensity of it.
Getting through the intensity, but there's still more to do after that. It's not just, okay, I got through it. It's, I got through it. Now, what do I do with the energy that I'm aware of within me that has calmed down, but it is still there and circling and cycling and spiraling, and it will resurface if I don't do something to get it out.
Mm-hmm.
Something like
exactly.
that.
Exactly.
So what would that be? Let's go into that a little bit, right? We've done
like what would the release look like?
We've gotten through the intensity. What would a release look like?
So a release is different. It depends if you want a mental release or if you want a physical release. And sometimes you want both, but sometimes you want to choose. So like a mental release is journaling, right? Like journaling the worry down, or journaling the anxiety down, or journaling whatever realistic or unrealistic thoughts you have, just so they're out of your head and they're down on paper. And for some people, they could just journal them, put them there, and they're like, okay, I feel good. Not that I did anything with the thought, but I just got it out. And like, that's enough for me right now. And it is. Sometimes too, though, like we need more of a physical approach. Also, I think it depends on the type of anxiety it is and what it's causing inside of you. You know what I mean? Like sometimes people need to run it out and like really get their heart rate going, really get their body moving in order for them to feel like they're at a place of like, okay, I could now continue with the rest of my day, right? Like I'm not debilitated by this. Like I'm able to function. So I think it's, there's a mental release of things, there's a physical side of release. And, there's countless things that could fall into both categories.
So for the average person listening who's like, well, how the heck am I supposed to know which one I should choose?
Hmm.
What would you say to that person? Like,
I mean,
ask.
I think it's also what your need is, and like also what you're capable of doing at that moment. Like if you're at work and you're working till 5 o'clock and it's 3 o'clock, yeah, you can't get up and go for a run in the middle of your workday. Like,
Hmm.
that's not realistic. Maybe
Okay.
you only have 2 minutes, but you could journal really quickly for 2 minutes just to get the thoughts out.
Yeah. Okay.
Or maybe it's raining and it's, a windstorm outside. And you're like, oh, I'm not going to go for a run here, but you could do 10 or 15 jumping jacks in your bedroom just to excrete some energy. So then it's out, right? I think it's also like dependent on where that person exactly is at that moment, what they're capable of doing and what's realistic.
Yeah, I think realistic seems to be the word. That's where I would have gone with that. What's realistically, what can you do right now? Based upon where you're at, what you're able to do physically. If you can't go running, then I guess running isn't going to be an option. You
Hmm.
know. So what are like? I mean, can we kind of come up with as best of a list as we can with things that like for a mental release? What would be some of the things? So to get it out of me, right? I would write it down because if I'm writing it
Hmm.
down, it's outside of me. Um, if I'm speaking to someone, I'm getting it outside of me. If I'm venting or getting it out, right?
Hmm.
But I definitely want to make sure I'm doing that with the right person because otherwise they're going to either feed my cycle or enable the same patterns or piss me off even more. Or you kind of want to preface. I just need you to listen. I don't want a response. I just
Hmm.
need to get this out. Can you do that? Can you just
Hmm.
listen? Like if you respond, I'm going to smack you. Okay, like very clearly. Right?
Boundary. Set a
Maybe don't
boundary.
say that exactly. Depending on, I mean, if you're close enough with the person, it'd be a funny thing to say. But
If you're talking to your mom, probably not.
right, right, exactly. Unless your relationship with your mother is weird. So, um, anyway, the so writing it out,
Hmm.
talking it out,
Hmm.
getting the energy out with some kind of movement, right? Whether it's exercise, something like
Hmm.
that. I do this more than I probably admit, and more than other people might think healthy. I'll go in my car and scream sometimes. It feels
Hmm.
so good to get out a
I
good
love that.
primal screaming.
Hmm.
I think
Sometimes
that's
singing too, like going off of primal screaming. Sometimes singing does that too. Like put on your favorite song and sing your little heart out. If you're in the car, if you're in the shower, or if you're alone in your house, it's still a type of release. Yes, it's not directly talking to the anxiety, but that release also might give you enough that you're like, oh wow, I feel so much better by that.
yeah. Like think about what it is that you do to quote unquote release.
Hmm.
And that's we're talking about stuck energy here. We're talking about stuck energy. So like progressive muscle relaxation would probably be a good one for release. Where I'm
Hmm.
going through and you could literally go on YouTube and type in progressive muscle relaxation 5 minutes. And
Correct.
in 5 minutes you will have someone who's posted something on YouTube. The ones that have the most views are probably the best ones. And they have a calming, soothing voice, and they're guiding you
Hmm.
through every muscle in your body, tensing it and then letting it go and releasing it,
Hmm.
and then tensing it and then releasing it. And it's this physical representation of what you want to be doing energetically, emotionally, mentally, and it helps
And
a
those
lot.
are things that you could do while you're at work, right? Like you could put your
Right.
hands under, if you're in a meeting, put your hands under the table and like squeeze your hands as tight as you can and then release, or squeeze your wrist as tight as you can and then release.
Mm-hmm.
Those practices are much more realistic, kind of no matter where you are.
Right.
Another type of release too that I've recommended to a lot of clients is like if you take a pillow and you throw it as hard as you possibly can, right? That's a release. And if the anxiety is also connected to some anger, that's a really healthy way to express that anger too.
Mm-hmm.
Or take a piece of paper and rip it into as many small pieces as you possibly can. Like don't stop until they are like the tiniest little pieces of paper. It's a
Mm.
release. And I think some things with a release is like you want to try to get your heart increased a little bit. So you do feel when you're finished with the release, like, okay, that feels better. Like I got something out of me. I got this energy. Like you said, this energy went somewhere and I feel better from that.
Yeah. Yeah, if we want to express it, we want to get it out. Express, get the pressure out. So, in some way, shape, or form. And it's interesting
Yeah.
you just mentioned anger because throughout the week when I was, I know we both were reading a little bit more on anxiety than probably usual, or that didn't normally come up in whatever videos we're watching, books we're reading, etc. Um, I remember reading something along the lines that, and it triggered me to think about my own childhood, my own life, a lot of my life, where my anxiety presented as a form of like unreleased anger.
Mm,
There was like this energy in me that I just wouldn't own. Like I avoided feeling angry at all costs because I was always the peacekeeper. My identity was I'm the healer, I'm the
mm,
peacekeeper. And that, hey, I went into counseling. Oh my God, lo and behold, uh, it was a very natural thing for me, just based on the household that I was brought up in, through no fault of anyone else's. It's just how I internalized and
mhm,
grew up. So for me, I look back and I think about all the anxiety that I had as a kid, the nervousness that developed to anxiety that caused me to avoid things and this patterns of avoidance and fear in my life. I never, ever, ever felt anger. And that's
mm,
just really inhuman to say that. I
mhm,
never allowed myself to feel anger. And there were a lot of times, I think, as I got older, that unembraced, that unowned anger being avoided in some way, shape, or form turned into anxiety.
mhm.
There was
And I like,
so much energy wrapped around. I'm sorry, but let me finish this last thought. There was so much energy wrapped around avoiding being angry I believe this is what it was. Like my understanding of it, that putting so much energy towards avoidance caused my body to think that there
mhm,
was an actual serious threat, and I needed to be in panic, adrenaline filled fight or flight mode because of it. And I would have these little anxiety attacks. I didn't even know what they were when I was younger, but I would have them,
mhm.
and I was not feeling anger. That's for damn sure. But I should have. If you saw what my sister did to me, I should have been angry. Why wasn't I? I wasn't
Mhm.
allowing myself to be. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I love how you term that unembraced because I think that is a really good term to summarize that. Like, if we don't own that experience, right, exactly like you, right? If you didn't own that, you fed the wrong energy to the wrong place. And then the anger was kind of this underlying thing that maybe would manifest in other ways,
Mm.
but maybe it just stayed in your body. You're like, well, I have this anxiety, it's not moving, it's not moving. You know what I mean? Like that does something to us. And I think sometimes like when we don't embrace that, like we're in such denial. Like think about people who are like worrisome thinkers or people who are really pessimistic thinkers. Like we don't want to admit that we're a pessimist because that doesn't sound good, right? Like we don't like to hold the mirror up for ourselves and really own that. But like if we don't own it, then we're not able to change it. And for you, like you owned it, you embraced it, and you're like, okay, now I could do something with this.
Hmm.
But it
It took
wasn't
me a
until
long
you did,
time.
of course. Oh, of course, I'm sure. And it wasn't until you got to that point that you're like, oh, okay, this is a thing. And I now need to do something about that.
Yeah, it's it's funny how it works because it's that in itself never actually came up
Hmm.
until really like reading about it this past week. But it is something that it has changed because I do allow myself to feel and get angry now, which is awesome and healthy
Hmm.
and natural and normal and important. What I do with it is much different than most other people.
Hmm.
Most of the time, I'm not perfect, but it's no, it is interesting to look back on that and like the fact that now I own it and can see it, and I guess I've consciously chosen to be different with it because of the patterns I've seen in my life and the results I've seen in my life. In a nutshell, the life that I'm currently living, what I see in my relationships and stuff. If I want it to change, I've got to change. So
Hmm.
diving into those patterns, you see some of this stuff like, oh, I never
Hmm.
really get angry. Let me look at that. But I never connected it to anxiety until this past week.
Hmm. How did you, do you mind me asking how you dealt with the anxiety growing up? Like, what was your coping or what did you rely on to help you?
I self soothed through a very weird nervous tick type of thing. So anyone who knew me growing up I was always a nice kid. I was always good in school. I was always good at sports. I had like everything going for me. But you would see me out on the field or taking a test, just twitching the whole time,
Mhm.
twitching, totally twitching. And if it wasn't a facial, like recognizable twitch, it was a noise. I made noises with like my nose or my throat. And I was constantly, there was a nervous tick. There was a nervous
Mhm.
habit. And they were, I couldn't stop them. I couldn't control them. They happened very unconsciously until I'll never forget it. It was in fifth grade. The teacher called me and my parents in. and, and she, in a nutshell, was like, I think there's something wrong with your son.
Hmm.
And I was so mortified. I was so embarrassed. I didn't know people heard and saw it. I thought I had it under control that I started to internalize it. And when
Hmm.
I decided, it just happened naturally. When I started to internalize it, this is a perfect example of like life just happening and us trusting the path. Because back then I was mortified. I was so embarrassed that I had to internalize it. I had to come up with a way where like, all right, I can't do this stuff out loud anymore. So what do I do? I started playing with numbers and words in my head.
Hmm. That's so
And
interesting.
now I rap and rhyme, and I'm very big into wordplay. And anyone who knows me knows it's like a natural gift. Like it flows. I do it quickly, more quickly than even I expect sometimes. And
Mhm.
it's awesome. And I'm gonna release more and more. You'll see it, look out on social media for it as I start releasing it. But that internalization process, that me coping with the embarrassment and learning how to bring it into me, has led to this gift slash ability to be really good with wordplay now. Because I used to
Mhm.
turn words around in my head. Like if you somebody said the word flabbergasted, like that's I would attach to that word just because it has lots of syllables and sounds and consonants and vowels, and I would play along with glabberfasted and faberglasted, and I would move letters around and I would say it backwards. That's agrabelf, and I would do like I would, and that is flabbergasted backwards. Like it, I would just play.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
this is what it has evolved into. So back then, that was my big coping mechanism. I also avoided. I just
Yeah.
avoided. And that's not a coping mechanism. That's a good way to develop anxiety. So I had a lot of anxiety. I didn't cope. I got through it as best I could with my tics and my wordplay. But as a kid, you just do what you think is best. Like
Yeah.
it's very much like a survival mechanism almost for kids. I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but I just went off. So sorry.
No, it was, and it makes so much sense because I always say you're like Dr. Seuss 2.0. I just don't understand your brain and your play with words, but it makes so
Mm,
much sense after, because I didn't know this about you. You know what I mean? After
right.
explaining that story, like it totally makes sense. But it's also interesting, like you as a child use words and numbers, right? Like you made a play on that, but it can make so much sense if somebody uses drugs or someone uses alcohol or someone uses getting addicted to the internet, right? Like how detrimental this could be if we don't do something with it.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Because that energy's gonna go somewhere.
Hmm.
It's
And it
gonna.
doesn't go away, right? It's not like, oh, I'll avoid. And eventually it's just not going to be. No, it's still there. It's just manifesting in other ways. And it becomes really detrimental too when it like manifests in like medical ways, right? Like GI issues or headaches or, there's countless things medically that could happen if things just don't go addressed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. Hmm. I'm all thrown off now too because of how deep I just went, and I didn't expect to say all those things and put all that together, and I'm aware of it obviously, but
Hmm.
I apologize. My mind.
Why?
I need a
Don't
moment to
apologize.
recenter.
You're allowed to recenter.
uh,
What what do you do to recenter? It's actually a really good segue.
that is a really good segue. To recenter, or another way to put it would be to ground myself, right? To ground myself back in the present moment. I think we even said the word grounding last episode, and we wanted to expand on what it means. To be grounded, I would say, means to have one's feet literally and metaphorically planted, regardless of what's going on around me. Like a tree is grounded. A tree has its roots in, but when there's a big gust of wind, even during a hurricane, It's, the branches are blowing all over the place. The leaves are all over the place. There's good fruit. There's rotten fruit. There's good acorns. There's rotten acorns. There's animals. Maybe there's not animals living in the tree, et cetera, et cetera. But regardless of all the details, my roots are firmly planted in the ground and I'm good. I'm okay. So when I think of grounded, I think safe, secure, firmly rooted, and firmly planted. Apply that to yourself how you will, if that makes sense. So where would you go with it? Grounding.
So, I mean, for me, I literally put my feet on the floor and I move them around. And I'm like,
But you
oh,
take
I'm
it
here.
very literally.
I'm literal. Like, nope, I'm here. I like squeeze my wrist. Like, yep, I'm good. Sometimes I'll look around the room and I'll be like, well, I like label objects. Objects are my thing. I'll be like, there's a lamp, there's a couch, there's a light, there's a laptop, there's a phone. All right, I'm good. And I carry on. So I think, and you're right, it can be done. However, the person needs it to be done. I know people who count numbers. I know people who label colors, you know what I mean? Anything to kind of get them back to the here and now.
Right.
To get, make it work.
Absolutely. For me, grounding comes a lot from just slowing myself down, taking a couple deep breaths. I think I just unconsciously do it. In this particular instance, I recentered by coming back to, the constant, which is all of my notes from, what I read during the week, from what's going on during this podcast, things you've said, things I've said. So I'm recentering myself in what we've been focusing on. And I immerse myself back in some of the words. And as I start to read them, I start to kind of get the flow back again. Like I dive back into this little flow. So,
and you could tell you've practiced a lot with recentering because it was a pretty quick process for you just now, right? Like this is not a unfamiliar practice at all. It's like you've done it many times. Whereas some people who don't typically recenter, to try recentering, I just want them to know like it might not be as quick as it was for you, like, because it does definitely take practice in order to get a little bit more of an expertise at it.
For sure. And I owe some gratitude in this recentering instance to you, because you, by asking me the question, what does that mean? It recentered me. It regrounded me. And oh, right. That's what we do in this podcast. We talk about concepts in mental health, emotional awareness, and personal growth. And it took me from my own personal history, which is almost impossible to not get lost in if you really go back there, because there's so many emotions, there's so many experiences. And I'm having these aha moments as we speak about it, right? That actually wasn't an aha moment. It's just an important one for me.
We're noticing it.
Yeah. But it does. It's much easier to recenter and get regrounded when someone outside of you can help you do it too.
Well, because it also didn't allow you to stay in your head, right? Like we're live on a podcast. You weren't able to spend too much time up there because I would eventually be chiming in or asking you something or something of the sort. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think ideally what eventually happens after practicing it enough, so your voice in this particular instance that helped me recenter would be my own internal voice. And I would consciously choose to bring that internalized recentering or grounding voice to myself. But again, it's not a voice I'm going to have any familiarity with if I'm not listening to guided meditations, coping techniques, like every day. If I'm not consistent with that voice every day, I'm not going to be able to lift a heavy weight and push, and get that emotional or mental weight off my chest when the time comes, because I haven't been exercising in that direction enough. My muscles won't be strong enough.
And I think it's okay to say too, like no matter, even for you and I'll be the first to admit this too, like when it comes to anxiety, like I know you and I practice so many different like tools that help us out throughout the day to day. But the anxiety will still come, right? It's not like it never comes because you're taking care of yourself and you're coping and you're grounding and you're releasing, right? Like you're labeling your body. You could be the most connected individual, and the anxiety could still come, and it's what you do with that. And I think the purpose of last podcast, today's podcast, and the future podcast of anxiety is like we really want to teach people like what you can do with it, and really just give them as many options as possible, so then they do start to make some real changes in their lives. And I'm really happy you shared that today, because I think that was a perfect story, if you will, for what it really looks like in practice too. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and luckily I'm so smart that I planned to share that story.
I mean, thank
That
God.
I this was all written out. I basically just, read my notes. So I'm just that incredibly smart.
I mean, and intuitive.
Intuitive, humble. Humble's a big
Mm,
word.
mm,
So
mm.
sure. As long as you recognize it, I'm okay. It's just
Only validation. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, just make
Gold
sure you
star.
recognize it. That's all. Something I wrote down that you just brought up too. Like there's a difference to me between anxiety, which is, a diagnosis. Anxiety
Mm,
disorder, there's a marked period of dysfunction for a certain amount of time in a certain amount of life areas that we can
mhm.
tangibly point to, that there's deficits, that there's issues, etc. Dysfunction, like actual dysfunction. That would be anxiety. But if I say I'm anxious, it's akin to me saying I'm pretty nervous right now.
Mhm,
I would say it's a synonym for the word nervous to me.
mhm,
So there's a very big difference between, yeah, I still get nervous. Yeah, I still get a little angsty that before we run groups, if we're when we do our podcasts, I still feel it like a little bit because I know it's going to be in front of other people, and
mhm,
people may judge me or disagree with me, or I may say something stupid, or
mhm.
who knows. So, to me, there's definitely difference between those two. I
I
want to
totally.
go into, unless there's anything you're feeling that we really didn't look at enough in terms of coping. I definitely want to talk about, instead of the symptomology, the etiology, the cause. Like where does anxiety come from? What is it? What can we understand it? And again, we're already running late in this episode, which we did the same thing the last episode. But maybe we can highlight it again. What I started talking about last time. To me, like if somebody says to you, "What is anxiety?"
Mhm.
What I know what I would say. What would you say?
Fear of the unknown, my go-to.
Anxiety is fear of the unknown. So I make it a
Mhm,
little more like literal. So I
mhm,
go to anxiety is the body's physiological response to an overestimated threat. That's what I would call anxiety. So
mhm,
uh, let me slow down and go into that. So the physiological response, meaning like my heart is pounding, my breathing's getting quick and sharp, I'm going into fight or flight mode, right? And we know what that feels like. There's goosebumps, sometimes we're lightheaded. There's definitely heart pounding. There's a tightness in the gut. There's certain feelings when we are in fight or flight mode, right? Panic mode, if you will.
mhm,
So it's the body's physiological response to an overestimated threat. So overestimated means I'm not seeing it for what it is. I'm thinking the threat is a lot more than what it really is. So social anxiety, right? I'm so concerned with how others perceive me, I can't even go out. I get so much anxiety. The reality is people are so freaking narcissistic and kept, in their own worlds that they're not
mhm,
thinking twice about you. They don't even notice you. They, which may lead to anxiety as well. Why don't people notice me? Who knows? But it's just like one example of,
mhm,
of what I'm talking about. But this, like, so to me, that like, what is anxiety? It's the body's like that overestimated threat. Where does that come from? How come some people overestimate threats and have or feel anxiety
mhm.
or a fear of the unknown, right? Because that plays into absolutely this overestimated threat. I don't know what the threat is, so I'm going to freak out and go into fight or flight mode immediately.
Mhm,
What causes some people to go there and other people to stay pretty grounded? What's
mhm.
what's the difference? What causes it? What do you think?
I think there's a lot there, and I
Yeah,
think we'll obviously touch upon it now and then start here next podcast too.
sure.
Is there's a nature versus nurture element in this,
Okay.
right? And I believe like how we are raised and how we are taught or raised to deal with things is definitely a component. Some of us are raised with parents that are worriers, right? Like my mother. My mother is I always call her worry wart. She's always worrying constantly, but she never projected that worry onto me, right? Like she was worried, but it came from a really sincere place that it wasn't making me a worrywart too.
Sure.
She contained it. But there's other clients that I work with, and their parents have put on all of their worries on top of them. It's almost like a generational worry type of thing. Like one worry from the next worry to the next worry. So I think a lot of it is how we're raised, but I also think a lot of it's also like our life experiences. If someone experienced a trauma, you better believe that they have a whole new set of worries after the trauma than before that trauma. And why that is too is it changes how we view the world. If the world is a really bright and shiny place, and then we go through something that was not bright and shiny, our worldview changes and it becomes dark and scary. And then there's worries that come with that. And there's, realistic and unrealistic worries. And then the fight or flight mode, pops up more so now than it ever did before, right? Like that, I think there's a lot to this.
So conditioning, clearly a huge part of it. It's something I was taught without people even realizing they were teaching it to me. It's something that was modeled for me by the people that I looked to as my examples.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that was bred in me through my life experiences, that my brain had no choice but to start freaking out over things because it never freaked out before. And then this happened. And I didn't even know that this such and such was capable of happening in my life until it happened. So now I need to be on heavy alert.
Mm-hmm.
Your whole belief system and approach to life, your whole lens through which you see life has changed because of such a traumatic event that you've been through, for sure. Okay. And then there's so that's the nurture part of it. The nature part of it would be what? That it's DNA holds memory, and some of us are just more generationally predisposed to be this way.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I mean, it's also like when we're in the womb, right? Like whatever our mother was experiencing while pregnant with us, like that. And there's so many studies on that. Like it definitely impacts the child depending on how much stress the mother was over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That can impact it too. I would say that's more conditioning though. Like as the brain is forming, that's happening. It's already an experience that's like going to be latent or subconscious within our present life, but it was something that happened in our present life, not something that is just inborn in us. Well, I guess we weren't born yet, so it kind of is inborn, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
You see
it
where
could
I'm
go either way on that one.
It's prenatally inborn in us. I don't know why that sounded so weird when I said it, but I'm a weird guy. Okay. So in terms of where anxiety comes from, so there can be one huge traumatic event, there can be this conditioning, there can be a lot of small traumatic events. And that could be, and I think this is probably what the average person might, I would say this would be the majority, that, and I could be wrong with that, but like throughout your childhood, you'd see everything seemed fine. Everything was good. Everything was fine. Relatively speaking, you had a nice, calm household. But yeah, you had a dad who had some anger issues, but it was never bad enough that it was like worth even talking about. But your dad got angry. So like if you did something wrong, or even as like a 2 or 3-year-old, your dad would be so stressed or frustrated that he would scream. He would get mad. And think about it, as a 2 or 3-year-old, when you know deep down that you're still fully, completely, and utterly dependent on this person for your survival, and this person is either barking, screaming, whatever, breaking something, that is a threat to your existence at that point. That's not just a scary thing that's happening. It is horrifying, terrifying. Like we don't realize how horrifying and terrifying our behaviors can be to a 2, 3, or 4-year-old when we're angry.
It's the same thing of saying to your child, like, I'm not mad at you, I'm disappointed in you. Right? As a child, like that, I think everyone can relate to that. If our parents said it's like, oh my God, like I really, really, really messed up here.
Right. As opposed to just, yeah, I made mistakes too, honey. I did. I made a lot of them. You're going to learn from them. That's part of life. That's part of life. It's okay. Imagine that. Like, imagine that was the response to every time you screwed up. And don't get me wrong, there should be consequences. But the consequences in the physicality, the tangible consequences of life of losing my video games for the evening or the weekend, should have zero impact on my connection to you, my love for you, my non-judgment towards you, et
Hmm.
cetera, et cetera. But
Hmm.
unfortunately, things do have consequences. You do need to learn that.
And
Little
I know we're
parenting for the moment, but yeah.
right. And I know we're running low on time, but one quick thought that just because it's in my head, it's the same thing with teachers too, right? Like we're talking about parents and how parents are talking to us, but it's like also how teachers are talking to us too. Like I could go back in my memory right now, one teacher who was not very nice to me, and I remember it. Like I could put myself in the classroom right now, and it's like we have to be mindful of how we're treating our children
Mhm.
because we are feeding them negative and or positive, and then they're going to grow up and do something with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what's amazing about it too is that we really can pull power from pain. Right? That was I think our fourth episode that we just released actually. It was a lot of our focus was on like turning adversity, turning obstacles, turning pain into gifts, into power. I think my story is a perfect example of that.
Hmm.
I didn't even realize what I was turning it into power. And then looking back on it was like, wow, I turned that pain into power. Or at least
Hmm.
now that I'm actually expressing myself in writing,